This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It is the year 91, the spring of 91 AD. Domitian is our emperor for a while. We have a good century ahead of us. For reasons that we cannot explain, we can see all the way to the 21st century and all the way back, of course, as Roman citizens. And we're particular about how we look upon our empire and find a way to approve of the American empire 21 centuries from now, built on the foundations of the Roman Empire. However, there are analogies that don't work. There are historical facts that are not consistent with the way we Romans conducted ourselves and our empire. And that is a topic that Germanicus has agreed to enter in tonight. Germanicus and I are of an age in 91 AD, and we're of an age in the 21st century. And that age includes the events and the arguments and the paradoxes of the Vietnam War. Once upon a time. We're going to enter into it with our second cup of wine. The centurions are gathered around us. They want to hear this because they can't see the 21st century, but there are moments in the Vietnam War for America running roughly 1965 to 1975, those 10 years of major combat activity. The centurions are keen to hear about what can go wrong and why when you take on a insurgency in a country where the Roman method is Tacitus. We'll come to that. You know, desert, success, victory. However, we begin in Vietnam because, Germanicus, a very good evening to you. You and I remember Vietnam as if it's yesterday, and indeed it is yesterday for us. We were young men, and we were listening to the speeches by the President of the United States, Mr. Johnson, who was making decisions for the National Security Council, for the Pentagon, and for the Congress. He was an extremely adept legislator, inheriting the vice presidency and the presidency because of events, tragic events. But he managed the Senate, and he believed that he had control of the House of Representatives. Indeed, he did. He had a Democratic majority, a fine majority through the 60s. And he also inherited the Vietnam War, which was an outgrowth of the colonial empires that did not end at the end of the Second War. I don't want to do too much history here. I want to plunge right into March of 1965. All that is known. We can go over it in our conversation. The French, Eisenhower, Diem, the regime. But in the spring of 65, March of 65, Johnson is convinced that he must provide security for an air base at Da Nang that had suffered incoming mortar fire from what was called the Viet Cong, the insurgency in South Vietnam, itself an arbitrary construction, Vietnam being divided in half, north and south, as the French left their colonial empire behind. Another nightmare we're not telling. In any event, the Marines landed on the beaches ceremonially, lots of cameras. Here they come. The Americans are riding to the rescue as they did in the Second War, as they did in Lebanon, as they do everywhere. When the Marines land, everything's okay. Uncle Sam is here. And some of them flew in as well. That begins the nature of the war that may or may not be instructive for us as we talk about the war in Ukraine and other wars where the U.S. is participating with its money, its supply chain, and its rhetoric. It was said as quickly as 66 that the trouble with the Vietnam War was that we needed more troops, always more troops. Westmoreland becomes the commander on the ground of McPhee, always asking for more of this, more of that. There would be a moment where there were more than 500,000 American military personnel in Vietnam or attached to it. However, that deceives slightly because of all the units. Only 80,000 were combat troops at any one time, meaning there wasn't enough to overwhelm a nation of jungles and mountains and where there was a free walk through Laos and Cambodia for the enemy coming from North Vietnam. The word I want to get to now, too much introduction, beg pardon. The word I want to get to is that by 66, there were measurements of the war saying, we can't lose this, it's unlosable. But then there were other voices saying, yes, and it's unwinnable. In other words, the Americans were 1,900 dead in 65, and then it accelerated until there was 50,000 dead or more by the end of 75. It accelerated. It was unlosable for the Americans pouring their manpower in, but it was also unwinnable because of the way we were fighting the war and the way that the U.S. postured itself as saving the world from communist aggressors, China and Russia at the time. That struck me as a note for you when we consider the Ukraine war. My crude measure, the centurions are nodding their heads, my crude measure is that as long as the American military maintains its supply chain of anti-aircraft and small arms and money into Ukraine, they can't lose it. But it is unwinnable, and indeed, there is no program, either mentioned by Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump, to my knowledge, of a way to win the war, or as Westmoreland often said, victory's just around the corner. There is no case made for that. So, if a war is unlosable, and at the same time it's unwinnable, what is it? What is a program? It didn't work in 68, 65, 66, 67. Do we have another way of talking about the American quandary in Ukraine? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. We have to, as they say, unpack that. Because you go into a war believing you're going to win, especially if you are the ultima power, the superpower, and your last great war was a magnificent, rolling triumph across the world. And so the U.S. went into Vietnam believing that it would ride roughshod, as they say, over the Vietnamese. And I won't use any opprobrious terms. And that didn't turn out to be the case. But the fact that we believed it so strongly itself is interesting and also suspect. We believed it because we thought to ourselves, well, we fought one way in World War II, and now we're going into the jungles of Vietnam, but we have a new magic weapon. We have a new lightsaber, and it's called air mobile warfare. We have tens of thousands of helicopters. So the jungles don't matter. We won't be trudging through the jungles. We'll put people where we need to put them. They'll destroy the enemy, then we'll just take them right out. And that meant that America, again, going into Vietnam, was entranced by this overwhelming American belief, article of faith, that innovation in war means revolution in war. And so what happened in the last war doesn't count because we have new stuff that will triumph. And that's interesting in the context of Vietnam because Vietnam was preceded by a war that in retrospect ends up not looking so very different from the way that Vietnam ultimately ended up looking. And that's Korea. In Korea, we went in and we thought, we'll blow them away World War II style. And yet in the Korean War, the U.S. had inflicted upon it and its NATO allies, or UN forces actually, the greatest campaign defeat suffered by American arms since the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. We had forces up by the Yalu at the end of 1950, and we were forced back not just to the initial starting line, the parallel north of Seoul, but we lost Seoul. We were pushed way back, and the Chinese did that with a huge army with nothing but sneakers in wintertime, the most rudimentary equipment. And that was a real shock. And yet somehow we could simply wipe that away. Again, we had the Deus ex machina dispensation of technology because we had all this new technology. So it wasn't going to be like Korea again. Well, in fact, it ended up being worse. And so what happened was that we went in thinking there was nothing that could stop us. And we even had code words for operations like rolling thunder. Nothing was, or linebacker two, nothing was going to stop us. And yet we started losing helicopters by the thousands and tens of thousands. And it was a situation where, no, we couldn't lose, but now we couldn't really win either. And that is the situation that characterizes every American war, starting with Korea. Korea, we finally decided, well, we can't win this, so we better start looking for a way out. In Vietnam, actually, even though the period you bracketed from 65 to 75 is 10 years, by the end of the 60s, we were drawing down forces rapidly. And Nixon had instituted a program called Vietnamization. Well, Vietnamization is the same thing as Afghanization or Iraqization or whatever in this most recent forever war. And it didn't work in Vietnam, and it hasn't worked in the war since. And so what has happened remarkably is that we have fought a series of wars, which, as you say, we can't lose, but neither can we win. And once it becomes clear that the costs are eroding the quality and effectiveness of our military and creating all sorts of angst and opposition at home, that we better try and figure some way out. And this is, in fact, becoming the case in Ukraine. Now, the difference between Mr. Biden and LBJ, who are both tremendously insecure men, who felt the lesser of around the Ivy Leaguers who were their advisors, and who really were desperate for some great victory that would establish themselves in history, are getting exactly the opposite. And the Biden administration, the imperial court, worked hard to craft the Ukraine war so that it would not be another Vietnam. And they worked their hardest to make sure that that there would be no noticeable American casualties. And the war did not turn out, just as the war in Vietnam did not turn out. And in fact, the opposite attained. We completely underestimated our enemy in every possible way, and went to war based on our preferences, our desires. And those are being dashed now.
Yes, you especially about underestimating our enemy. There's a stronger word. The enemy vote. The enemy has agency. The adversary of the North Vietnamese, they adapted. For example, when they got the SAM missiles from Russia, that would oblige the only way a Air Force, the U.S. Navy aircraft could avoid a SAM missile, which was 3 times as fast as our jets, is to dive down as low as possible. But that brought them into range of the 50
light anti-aircraft, right?
So, I mean, they adapted. They adapted in the idea of the landing zones, LZs. They would create fake landing zones. They would smoke that was associated with the Marines to bring in helicopters. However, I come to this point because you trigger it very carefully, because we both know this story again and again and again. Right now, we're dealing with a regime in Kyiv that is non-transparent. It's the non-transparency of the Saigon regime was unknown to us at the time. We didn't know. We know that the Diem coup and the Min coup had been engineered in some fashion by the CIA, but we weren't sure. I mean, it was paranoid talk. And then they installed Tu and Key, each with their separate gangs. It was said, better a smart crook than a stupid, honest man, and we had smart crooks. There is no evidence that that is Kiev, but there's the feel of it. The same way, Germanicus, and then, 50 years from now, we'll know everything. We can't know it now. But we're depending upon a decision-making in Kyiv that doesn't stand up to the vote, that won't hold an election, that has entirely been dependent upon the U.S. supply chain, or the U.S. supply chain pressuring NATO. It's not a direct analogy, I understand, but there are creepy moments here when I mean lessons not learned. Putting one government in that does the bidding of the CIA or the DIA or the DOD did not work in Vietnam. How can it work here, Germanicus?
Well, it didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work in Afghanistan. It's not going to work here. In fact, what is shocking to me is that there are little fissures opening up through the veil that are giving us, if not transparency, little apertures through which we can see what is going on among the cabal of gangsters in Kiev. And Budanov, who is an important figure in the military effort, is now admitting publicly that Ukraine is going to lose the war. A gal in the Rada, or maybe she's a minister, I don't have it here, but she just came out and said, okay, so we're losing 350 dead every day. We're losing 750 wounded. 500 soldiers go AWOL. That comes out to 26,500 a month. And even if we make up half of that every month, we're still suffering a net loss to the army of 120,000.
And they
While Russia has a plus 120,000 every year.
And they won't draft the 18 and 19-year-olds just the way Saigon refused to draft them as well.
That is true, and yet there is a critical issue here. When you have a fertility rate at 0.7 and half of your country has left, if you kill the young men who are left, you will not have a country. In other words, there will be no Ukraine. So I can understand their desire here. Plus, if you do draft those young men, you're going to get a revolution. I mean, that little cabal is going to get smartly overthrown. Because right now, I don't know if you've looked, but I've seen literally hundreds of tapes of these brutal thugs beating up young men and pulling them into vans where they go off to their death.
Yeah.
And it is a stunning testament to American loss of moral authority to support such a war effort.
For those who do not know how the Vietnam War came out, it's never going to end as long as our generation, Michael's, Germanicus's, and my generation are with us on the planet. Never going to end. We'll take this up. We can't complete it, Germanicus. I think we can agree. The Centurions are disappointed, but we have to move on because it's the month of August, and there's some superstitions attached to August that always worth reminding as the month begins. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. We're in Londinium. It's a beautiful summer's evening in August of 91 AD. August name for the emperor that we sacrificed to, the man who developed the idea of empire. And here we are commenting on the American empire with a new emperor who has his moments. He has his Augustus moments. When we come back, what can go wrong in August? Germanicus and I will speculate. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Thank you. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. The Centurions are disappointed because we've moved on from the Vietnam War. We'll come back to it, fellas. Oh, it's okay, because we want to have some fun with superstition. August, a month where things are loaded. Europe goes on vacation, yes, true. And it's the end of summer, yes, true. And the southern hemisphere, it's wintertime, yes, true. But I'm going to name three big ones. August of 1914, okay. August of 1968, okay. August of, what was the Russian coup? Was that 91? I believe it was 90, a Russian coup against the Soviets. In other words, anything is possible. I'm using geopolitical examples. There's no special reason why August should have all these loaded dates, but except that it does. And I think it's momentarily entertaining to guess at what can go wrong this August that would damage the confidence of the American people or our allies in Europe. My example, Germanicus, I rush to use an example, is that both the Kremlin and Washington have been fooling around with the nuclear weapon metaphor of, if you don't do this, we'll have to do that. It happened recently in the last hours. Medvedev, the chief provocateur of the Kremlin regime, making remarks about nuclear weapons, and Mr. Trump, the emperor in Washington, responding with deploying nuclear-powered submarines with capabilities. I believe one of them is an Ohio-class boat, missile boat. But in any event, it's the nuclear weapon metaphor that is always both hard to believe, but at the same time cannot be dismissed. There are other events that are possible. Have you got one that you're watching out for, Germanicus?
I'm looking at the coming apart of the Donbass front, and I think that's really important. And it's hard for me to even raise that because we've talked about it so many weeks in a row. And one of the most frustrating dimensions of the war is that it does not fit social and other media expectations of a 24-hour news cycle. Everyone wants something to happen and keep happening. And it happens slowly, very slowly. And yet, right now, I've been watching this so intently, several hours a day for all these months, and this is unusually rapid erosion. And I think that could sneak up during this month with the fall of Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, and Liman, in which case there'd just be open terrain all the way to Pavlograd and deep into the heart of Ukraine. So this is something to keep an eye on. This could be a shock because, we talk about World War I and the Guns of August, but it was preceded by a month-long crisis. And then suddenly just boom, everything happened. And August is one of those strange months anyway. There's a very famous Victorian or Edwardian short story, August Heat, for example. It's the time of bank holidays and people leave for their vacations. And it's a strange kind of time of suspension. And, World War II, of course, broke out at the very end of August. And so this is a kind of a period where nothing is happening on the surface that people are talking about, but the drama is running in a subterranean quake, below the surface.
It was 91 with the KGB coup. I
Mhm.
mentioned that because there are a number of governments, and I won't use the loaded word regime, that are fragile all the time. One of them is Beijing, by reports consistently, that the loss of confidence in Xi Jinping is going to translate into him either being qualified, that is, to gain a group of advisors who are going to guide him through his years of the third term, or be removed entirely. That is one thing that's been working for weeks. And there's the annual retreat by the cognoscenti of the ACCP right now. They go to the beach, and they sit on the beach and sit around to decide what they're going to do next. So I mentioned we're keen on geopolitics. I also mentioned that we have market turmoil insofar as Mr. Trump is having great fun naming tariffs and taking them off and naming deadlines and taking them off. But there's a court case that was heard at the end of last week by the Federal Court of Appeals in D.C., and we're waiting for a decision challenging the very idea that Mr. Trump, that the chief executive has the power of the tariffs. And that would quickly go to the Supreme Court, and there's honest speculation that the court will say, no, he does not. That, because that would cause a great deal of turmoil in the markets. We also have the suggestion, again, that AI can disturb everything. I don't quite believe it, but I just repeat what I read. Artificial intelligence keeps getting these scary headlines and anxiety by people who are early to the dance. And these are not, they don't strike me as world-scale events, but as you just said, things tumble out of control. They start innocent enough. Oh, we can contain that. So what? The Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary is no longer with us. They'll find some other chump to take it over. But we know that ended badly. And when Prague Spring came along, no one saw the Soviets stripping all of the trucks that they needed to bring the harvest in that year in order to provide them to drive in their invading force into Czechoslovakia. No one saw that coming. And then the KGB coup, it was 91. And that spelled the end of the Soviet Union. Within, 5 months, the Soviet Union was no more and Gorbachev was no longer the premier.
Well, we can see some of these things happening. When I brought up the accelerated erosion in Donbass, that's a forcing function. That is a dynamic that could move the U.S. and its NATO minions to put in to replace Zelensky, for example. It might bring things to a head very quickly because it wouldn't necessarily be a complete battlefield defeat, but the symbolism of the fall of the cities I mentioned, in contrast to the long battles over a Bakhmut and Avdiivka that went on forever and ever, it seemed like a stalemate. But suddenly, the symbolism of things really beginning to come apart could lead to a coup, an engineered coup in Kiev, for example. Plus, I expect to see very unhappy things happen in Gaza, and that is also a very powerful dynamic because Israel is not going to back down in its goals, and its goals are it's a total war goal for them, and the U.S. is not going, meaning the U.S. Imperial Court and Congress are not going to ditch Israel. So this is going to continue, and it's going to cause major issues. And when I say major issues, I'm just kind of papering over the reality. Egypt and Jordan are on the verge of absolute upheaval and mayhem. Yeah. So there are things that can't be contained, but things that we know are waiting in the wings to happen because Israel isn't going to back down. And at some point, things are going to explode in the region. And this is hard, so August is a good time for that.
You remind me about Iran. The B-2 raid is led to, well, there are some parts of it that are witty. For example, the Iranian foreign minister is asking for the U.S. to pay for the damage. That's witty. It's the non-proliferation treaty, which vouchsafed in 1970, does not prevent a nation with a nuclear reactor from creating fuel taking care of the fuel for the nuclear reactor. I mentioned that that's sort of a large loophole, that you don't use bombers to answer a loophole in the non-proliferation policy treaty. At the same time, there's this: no inspection is adequate. We've learned that now, and yet we're going forward. How many times have people bombed? Let's say they bombed Iraq in 1980. They
Right.
Syria in 2007.
Hmm.
They bombed Iran in, well, weeks ago. And at all three incidents led to catastrophe. This most recent one hasn't yet, but it's early days. And so I mentioned that if you say by qualifying Saddam Hussein in 1980 led to the catastrophe of Iraq, if you accept that, and,
Hmm.
the bombing of Syria in 2007 led to the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war that started 4 years later, if you accept that, then there's another shoe or 500 shoes to fall on Iran. That would
Yeah.
be a suspect this month.
Yeah. And the connections between Iran and China continue to
Yeah.
intensify. So it will not simply be a regional issue if and when this happens. And of course, the U.S. has avowed, to the extent that our Secretary of State can avow anything, that we will not promote a regime change in Iran. They'll have to do it themselves. But that the kind of behavior the U.S. is engaged in that regard is um, so reliable in terms of America's inability to not meddle that I think that this is a potentially a wacky month. So
Germanicus, his Mark of Vlahos, I am Gaius. We have one more note. Our friend Tacitus. They make a desert and call it peace. The Roman way. The centurions, well, see what I said that? Germanicus, they turn back. They're
right.
suddenly it again. What? What? When we come back, Tacitus is saying 2,000 years later, does it apply given worldwide media, given instant connection, given the genius of agitprop? Do we make a desert and call it peace? Vietnam wasn't an example. Where does anybody conduct themselves in a similar fashion? This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Thank you. This is the History Debate Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. And just a note, because we're turning over things that haven't happened yet in the month of August, and we're reflecting on things that are written in stone from the 20th century, the Vietnam War. So I thought it would be momentarily diverting to talk about how we Romans handled insurgency warfare, how we Romans handled an enemy camp, how we Romans handled people who were troublesome over a long period of time. My example to you, Germanicus, is coming up at the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The decision making of that bomb dropping in 1945 is still debated and debatable about whether it was wisdom or not. It comes up every year. 80 years on, it hasn't been settled. But we certainly made a desert out of the U.S., inheriting the Roman style, made a desert out of Hiroshima and made a desert out of Nagasaki. And we're prepared to starve Japan out. We were prepared to do what was necessary to make the emperor sign surrender. And it worked. However, that was then. This is now. And you mentioned earlier Gaza. Right now, the Hamas speakers, whoever they are, wherever they are, have made a demand that is impossible for anybody to meet. They They're demanding Jerusalem as the capital. They're demanding a separate state. They're demanding the end of and the withdrawal of Israeli troops. They're demanding reparations. Deliberately impossible. Now, the Israelis at this point and their ally, the United States, are conducting themselves in were said to be precision attacks. However, that is not believable, given the scale of risk to the people who live in Gaza. So I mentioned that we Romans did not settle things in terms of peace. We Romans settled things in terms of victory or not. Vercingetorix is my example. When Caesar circled the town and the people were starving, not unlike Gaza, and Vercingetorix sent them out thinking that Caesar would feed them. He didn't. They starved to death in front of the enemy camp, and eventually Vercingetorix surrendered, was taken to Rome. There was a triumph, and he was strangled. And that was Caesar's model, and a model that Augustus inherited, and that we here in Londinium, the centurions are back. You see how they're nodding their heads. Now, is that something that you think is credible for the American empire in the 21st century?
The closest correspondence between ancient Rome in antiquity and the United States today in modernity is the ruthlessness with which both Rome and America deal with their enemy. The Romans are famous for having made of Carthage a desert and called it peace, as Tacitus said. But you mentioned Caesar. He killed over 1 million Gaulois. I mean, that's what, 10, 20, 30% of the population? Even in late Rome, when the Burgundians were put down, they lost a third of their people. When the Rugi invaded in 406, Stilicho defeated them and wiped out all the men and sold all the women and children into slavery. And just as Belisarius did with the Vandalic kingdom, we'd have done the same thing. In the last 9 months of the Pacific War and the winter that followed, 5% of Japan died. They either starving at home or starving in places like Rabaul, where they were bottled up, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers with no food. And the two A-bombs themselves, if you look at the 10-year period after the bombs were detonated, 300,000 died. Now, there's a huger number who died from conventional bombing, but as you mentioned, the blockade, we were very successful, and we had Japan completely shut out from the rest of the world. The bombings didn't just kill Japanese, it emptied all of their cities. And farmers did not really want to share their food with millions of Japanese urban dwellers. So the prospect would have been, had we not invaded Japan, that 30 or 40 million Japanese would have died. Had we invaded Japan, the number might have been, well, comparables.
Right.
That's true genocide. In the Korean War, and this is not our doing alone, I mean, you have to look at North Korea and China, but 10 to 20% of Korea died in the period from 1945 to 53. In Vietnam, it was over 10% during the whole course of that war, at least. And we killed over 1 million Iraqis, for example. I could go on. I mean, we precipitated the civil war in Syria, and 500,000 died there, and several million fled. We completely orchestrated the Saudi Arabian war with Yemen, and 500,000 Yemeni were killed. The responsibility to protect Samantha Power intervention in Libya led to at least 500,000 dead in the chaos that followed. This goes on and on and on. And I can only say, hey, we're Romans, baby.
Okay. You've convinced me suddenly, I realize. And I mentioned that 1 million Gauls that were killed by Caesar. There were only 100 million people on the earth at that point. So we're talking about 1% of humanity. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima example, that bomb, well, we'll get to it. We can't settle it, but the Centurions are smiling.
Yes.
Well, I understand professional soldiers. When you're sent into an insurgency, you don't want this to be a forever war, and that's what Vietnam turned out to be, and that's what Ukraine's turned out to be. And I like your example of Ukraine collapsing of a sudden. It's the 3rd day of August now, 4th day of August. Yes, it's the 3rd day of August into the 4th day of August, so we have several weeks to go. Germanicus and I will return. We're on to Augustus. It is Augustus's month, the sacrifice. The theater's closed for the month of August, and that's fine. People go away on holiday. Not us. We're Equus class. We never work. We just enjoy sitting by the Thames, doing a little shopping afterwards. So this is the Friends of History Debating Society. On to the god Augustus, a sacrifice. He deserves all of our thanks. I'm John Batchelor.